So this video is to provide some instruction for optical illusion number 1, which is inspired by Bridget Riley. We're creating essentially a stencil to create a wavy or zigzag line repeatedly. And stencils are very helpful with trying to get things consistent and measured accurately. So if you're going to make your stencil, you need to make sure you have something that's probably a little bit thicker than a regular piece of paper. I'm going to provide some of these in class, but if you are working from home remotely and you don't have that option, then you can find things around your house that are a little bit thicker. So, you know, that could be a cardboard box. You could have some cardstock or thicker paper, or maybe you go to your kitchen and look at some of the food boxes, like a cereal box would be great. You would just need to be, you know, doing some measuring. So once you find your piece of cardboard or cardstock, you want to make sure it's cut into 4x4 and make sure to use the corner of it so you try and get that really accurate 90-degree angle here in the corner. So once you have your stencil, if you want to practice it, which I highly recommend, take a scrap piece of paper or an extra sheet of paper that's in your sketchbook as a practice. I'm going to trace out the square. So I'm holding it with my left, marking with my right, and that way it's the same size. So this is going to be my practice. A couple things I need to do is create a stencil that's going to have, like I said, like some type of zigzag or a curved line. This is going to create a sense of movement. So the curvier it is, you know, the more movement you're going to get, or the more it goes up and down in a diagonal pattern, you're going to get more movement that way. Couple things for your stencil is I like to measure just a little bit to make sure it's gonna start and end in the same measurement, because it makes it easier to line up. So I'm just gonna measure at least let's say like halfway, so 2 inches here. And this project does have quite a bit of measuring so that things are precise. Probably the most measuring you'll have to do for any project that you ever have with me. So 2 inches and 2 inches on this side. That way your line starts and ends at the same measurement. This will be very helpful later. So I'm going to create a wavy or zigzag, or maybe both, line going across. I would not create so much detail that you know, it becomes difficult, but it doesn't have to be extremely subtle as well. Meaning your line, you don't have to get very, very detailed with it, because this you have to trace and you have to cut. So it's going to be very difficult to get precise lines with this teeny tiny stencil. So I would recommend, you know, if you're going to do zigzags, for example, maybe you just have a couple. A wavy line, instead of, I've seen students do this, and this becomes so intricate and difficult that it ends up very, you know, it becomes very difficult to work with. So maybe it's just a few waves, and you're still going to get a lot of movement, but it is okay to simplify it. I have found that when you're making waves or zigzags, if you go backwards and then forward with something like this, I've noticed that you could run into problems with the lines overlapping. So for example, you would end up getting something like this as you keep tracing it over and over again. You're gonna have a lot of overlap. So try and avoid having your lines kind of go back and forth, left and right, because then they're gonna overlap funny, and just kind of keep it consistent with up and down. And this is why we practice, because you may end up creating a stencil that you don't like, and then you would know before you put it on your final. All right, so I have my little 2-inch line here, 2-inch line here. Now I'm going to create a line going from left to right, and I just want to make sure I end up with that last point there. And then I use my scissors to cut it out. which I didn't already have, so make sure you have some scissors. And I'm just very carefully going to trim a very steady line as best that I can. I'm using the inside of the scissors to have a little more control over the cut. Versus if you're, you know, snipping away at the end of the scissors, it's a little bit harder to control it. Okay. So now I have a stencil. You can let go of that, throw it away, recycle it. Okay. And I'm ready to have my stencils that I can trace over and over and over again. So instead of just randomly placing it in this square and just eyeing it, you need to do a little bit of measuring. So on the sides of my box, I'm going to create little measuring marks. The requirement for this design is every 1/8 of an inch. Meaning you may have to check out your ruler and see how many little dash marks are in between each number. I have a ruler that's measuring a 1/16 of an inch, meaning that there's 16 little tallies here from one number to the next. So that's a 1/16 of an inch. It doesn't have to be that small. I'm looking for an 1/8 of an inch. So with my ruler, I'm looking at every other dash mark. And that means I should have 8 sections between each inch if you're gonna double check your work. So I actually will be kind of skipping over every other line. So on this side, I'm measuring 1 inch. I'm sorry, not 1 inch, but a solid number. And then I'm marking every other little tally mark. If you cannot handle 1/8 of an inch, I have had students move to 1/4 of an inch. But the movement and detail is not as strong. So I'm looking for you to have an 1/8 of an inch, but if you're really struggling, then move to a 1/4 of an inch. And that would be, you know, your halfway point between the two numbers, and then another halfway point in between that. More important is just to make sure these little tally marks are consistent and accurate as you can get it. So 1/8 of an inch all the way across. Same thing on the other side. Making sure solid number starts on the left, just like it did before. That way, if there's a little bit extra than the 4 inches, it's not going to mess with my measurements. So every other little tally mark. I do suggest marking these with your pencil. Only time you should be using like a pen or a Sharpie or permanent medium is when you're applying the final medium, making it permanent. It's okay to use a pencil. Mechanical pencils are great because they erase really well without denting the paper. Okay, 1/8 of an inch all the way across. And now I have those measurements on both sides, left and right. So now that I have my stencil, I can use that to move along my 4x4 square here. Now I know I just said the whole spiel about using a pencil, but if I use a pencil for this design to go back later and to outline it with a permanent medium, you're not going to have those steady lines. Some students that do it that way, but they still use the stencil later to outline it. That's up to you, but like I said, I don't normally do this, but for this particular assignment, I just moved to the final medium. Now, you can use the ultra thin Sharpie that's in your supply bag, but you also have the option that you can work with a thick or a thin marker as well as different colors. So you can create a pattern with the color choices that you pick. So I'm gonna go with blue and red and make a fun pattern with that. I'm a right-handed artist, so I'm holding the stencil steady with my left hand, and I'm just lining it up with the tick marks on the side. So those little dashes. Now you don't have to start at the very first one if you want to give yourself a little bit of breathing room up at the top where there's the negative space, the background around it, to balance out at the bottom. You can, meaning, so if you don't start with the first one, maybe I start with the second or third, just make sure it's the same on both sides. So I'm starting at dash line 3, and then I want to make sure it's 3 on this side too. So 3 and 3. So I'm going to hold it steady, and then with my right hand, mark the edge. Now when it goes outside the box, I'm going to skip over it and then just kind of continue my line on the other side, trying to make sure that I don't go outside the box. Got my first line there, and then I'm going to move to the next dash mark after that, and do the same thing. And after a couple lines, I'm going to switch to a different color. So of course you could alternate each time if you wanted, or you could do a couple rows and then add another color or another color, as long as your pattern is consistent. So I'm going to do 3 lines of blue and then add a red in there. Now I know you guys are not robots, so sometimes I do see things like a little bit of a hesitation mark. That's okay, just take your time. You're not a machine, so just try and be accurate, but you may see a few things like that. Don't give yourself a hard time about it. So that red line in there, maybe I'll do 3 blue, 2 red. That sounds fun. Just take your time, and I'd switch back over to the blue. If you do not use the stencil, it will show. Unfortunately, if you want these to be accurate and consistent, you have to use the stencil. And you will notice too, depending on how much movement you have with your line, meaning if you have a design that has a lot of up and down, you'll notice that they'll start to almost kind of share lines. So as you're going up here, they may converge closer together before separating at the top. And this is normal, okay? So rely on your stencil. That's gonna overlap those lines and give you the illusion of a little more depth as you use your stencil, meaning it's gonna get closer and then separate. This is where Bridget Riley, they talked in the video about how the lines seem to kind of breathe because they're constricting and then getting wider. But you should get a sense of movement with the more that you add. So just for time's sake, let's pretend that I did all of these lines and I continued my pattern. You do not have to go all the way to the bottom. You could leave your stripe design here with a little bit of paper breathing room at the top and the bottom. It's up to you. I would not, if you're gonna go off of the 4x4 square here, I would measure little dash marks here so that it's consistent, because I've seen people get to the very bottom and then they just freehand the last couple ones and it doesn't end up looking very nice, and you can tell that it's been freehanded. So if you're gonna make a line, just make sure you have little tally marks to mark its place. Okay.